The large conference hall in Seoul was full of people. Scientists from all over the world sat in their chairs, waiting for the two presentations that would change the future of space exploration. The air felt heavy with excitement and tension. Dr. Jin Hyun walked onto the stage first. Her red suit matched the color of the planet she dreamed about, Mars. She was 35 years old and had spent the last 10 years planning how humans could live on the red planet. The screen behind her lit up with a beautiful image of Mars. Mars is not just another planet, Hyun said in a clear voice. It is our future home. She showed pictures of the Mars surface, pointing out places where people could build homes under the red soil. Yes, it is far. Yes, it is cold. But Mars has everything we need. We can make fuel from its ice. We can grow food in special greenhouses. Most importantly, Mars is big enough to become a real second home for humans. Many people in the audience nodded. They could see her vision of cities under the Martian sky. But then someone stood up from the front row. It was Dr. Kim Do-young, wearing a gray suit that reminded everyone of moon rocks. He was the same age as Hyun, but he had different ideas. Your turn, Dr. Kim, the conference leader said. Hyun sat down, and Do-young took her place on stage. He changed the screen to show pictures of the moon. The moon is right there, Do-young said, pointing up even though they were indoors. We can see it every night. It takes 3 days to reach the moon. It takes 8 months to reach Mars. He showed a video of the moon's surface. We have already been to the moon. We know how to get there. We can build bases in its caves to protect people from space radiation. We can mine its ice for water and fuel. The audience started whispering. Both speakers made good points. Both had strong plans. Both could be right. Hyun raised her hand. But the moon is too small, she said. It doesn't have enough gravity to keep people healthy. Mars has better gravity. Do-young smiled. But the moon is close enough for us to help if something goes wrong. On Mars, people would be alone. An old scientist in the back stood up. Why do we have to choose? Why not use both? The room got quiet. Hyun and Do-young looked at each other. They had been so busy competing that they hadn't thought about working together. The moon could be our first step, Do-young said slowly, like a practice run. And Mars could be our final goal, Hyun added. But then Hyun's assistant, Lee Jun-ho, rushed onto the stage. He whispered something in her ear. Her eyes got wide with excitement. We just got news from our test site in the desert, Hyun announced. Our new radiation shield works. It can protect people from Mars' dangerous radiation. She looked at Do-young with pride. We don't need to wait. We can go to Mars now. The room erupted in loud talks. Do-young's team looked worried. Their moon plans suddenly seemed less important. Do-young stood straight and tall. The moon is still closer, he said firmly. And we found something too. He waved to Park Mi-rae, his chief engineer. She showed a new picture on the screen. We found rare metals near the moon's south pole. Metals we need for spaceships. Metals that are running out on Earth. The competition between Moon and Mars was now officially on. Both teams had good news. Both teams had strong reasons to be first. And both teams knew that the next few months would decide the future of human space exploration. As Hyun and Do-young left the stage, they didn't know that their competition would lead to something much bigger than either of them had planned. The race to space was just beginning, and Earth would never be the same. 3 months after the conference, both teams were hard at work. On the far side of the moon, Dr. Kim Do-young watched as his team's robots built the first research station. The gray dust of the moon spread out in all directions. Earth hung in the black sky like a blue jewel. Station frame is complete, Park Mi-rae reported through the radio. She controlled the building robots from their base on Earth. Her fingers moved quickly over the control panel, starting to seal the walls now. Do-young smiled inside his spacesuit. They were making good progress. The moon base would have 3 main rooms, one for living, one for research, and one for growing food. They had chosen a deep crater that would protect them from space radiation. Meanwhile, in Chile's Atacama Desert, Dr. Jin Hye-yun and her Mars team faced different challenges. They had built a copy of their future Mars base to test their ideas. The desert's dried, red landscape looked very much like Mars. "Air pressure is dropping in Section 2. Lee Jun-ho called out. He pointed to the warning light on his screen. This was their third air leak this week. We need to find these problems now, not on Mars. Hye-yun nodded. Every problem they found on Earth was one less problem they would have on Mars. She walked through the base in her practice spacesuit. The suit was heavy and hot, but it was exactly like the ones they would use on Mars. Back on the moon, My-Ray's robots had finished the outer walls of the station. Do-young floated through the airlock and into the main room. The inside was still empty, but soon it would have computers, beds, and research equipment. "Look at this," My-Ray's voice came through his radio. She moved one of the robot's cameras to show him something in the moon dust. "Those sparkles. I think we found more rare metals." Do-young took samples of the shiny dust. If they found enough rare metals, they could prove the moon base was worth the cost. These metals were important for making spacecraft and computers. In the Atacama Desert, Hye-yun's team had fixed the air leak. Now they were testing their greenhouse. Real plants grew under special lights. If they could grow food here, they could grow food on Mars. "The tomatoes are doing well," Jun-ho said. He checked each plant carefully. "But the wheat isn't growing right. Maybe there's something wrong with the soil mix." Hye-yun looked at her phone. She had just gotten a message about Do-young's team finding more metals on the moon. Her team needed good news too. They needed to show that living on Mars was possible. "Try adding more nutrients to the soil," she told Jun-ho, "and check the water levels again." That night, both team leaders couldn't sleep. Do-young stood at the window of his room on Earth, looking at the moon where his station was being built. Hye-yun sat in her desert base, looking at Mars through a telescope. Suddenly, both their phones rang at the same time. The message was from the World Space Council. "First team to show their base can support human life for 1 year wins full funding for their project." Do-young called his team right away. "Mi-Ray, speed up the robot builders. We need to finish the station fast." Hye-yun gathered her team in the desert base. "We need these plants to grow. We need to fix every air leak. We need to show Mars is the better choice." The race was getting more serious. The Moon team had the advantage of being closer to Earth. The Mars team had the advantage of having more space and resources. But both teams knew that one small mistake could ruin everything. As the sun set over both the Moon and the Atacama Desert, the teams worked through the night. The future of human space exploration would be decided by their success or failure. 2 months had passed since the World Space Council's announcement. The Moon team's base was nearly complete, and the Mars team's desert tests were showing good results. Then both teams made discoveries that changed everything. Park Mi-Ray was guiding her robots through a routine scan of the Moon's surface when her computer screen lit up with strange readings. She checked the numbers 3 times to make sure they were correct. "Dr. Kim," she called Do-young on the emergency line. "You need to see this right away." Do-young rushed to her control room. On the screen, the robot's sensors showed a massive ice deposit hidden under the Moon's surface. But this wasn't ordinary ice. This ice contained pure water and rare minerals that could make rocket fuel. "This is exactly what we needed," Do-young said, his eyes wide with excitement. "With this much ice, we can make fuel for hundreds of space missions. We won't need to carry fuel from Earth anymore." The news spread quickly around the world. The Moon team's discovery made headlines. Moon ice could power future space travel. But the Mars team wasn't sitting quietly. In their desert base, Lee Jun-ho had been working on a special project. He had created a new kind of shield to protect people from space radiation. He tested it one last time before calling Hye-yun. "Watch this," Jun-ho said. He pointed to 2 plants in the greenhouse. One was behind his new shield. The other wasn't. He turned on a radiation detector. The protected plant stayed healthy while the other plant wilted quickly. Does it work on humans too? Hei-yun asked, trying to stay calm despite her excitement. Yes, Jun-ho smiled. We tested it with all kinds of radiation. It's light enough to carry to Mars, and it can protect an entire base. We can finally keep people safe on Mars. The Mars team's news also made headlines. New shield makes Mars life possible. Both discoveries reached the World Space Council on the same day. The council members met in an emergency session to discuss what this meant for the competition. Meanwhile, Du Young's team worked quickly to study their ice deposit. Mei-Rei's robots dug deeper into the moon's surface, finding more ice with each meter they went down. We could power missions to Mars with this fuel, Mei-Rei said as she looked at the data. Maybe even missions to other planets. In the desert, Hei-yun and Jun-ho started building a larger version of their radiation shield. They needed to prove it could protect a whole Mars base, not just a small greenhouse. The shield also protects against solar flares, Jun-ho explained to his team. This means we can stay safe even during the worst space storms. That evening, both team leaders received another message from the World Space Council. Both discoveries are significant. Competition deadline extended. First team to demonstrate practical use of their discovery wins. Hei-yun sat in her desert base office, thinking hard. Their radiation shield was amazing, but the Moon team's ice discovery was also very important. She looked at the Mars photos on her wall and wondered if they were still on the right path. In his Earth office, Du Young had similar thoughts. The ice deposit was valuable, but the Mars team's radiation shield could change everything. He watched the moon through his window and questioned if they were seeing the whole picture. Neither leader knew it yet, but their discoveries would soon lead them to an unexpected conclusion. The race between Moon and Mars was about to take a turn that no one had predicted. The warning came from the Space Weather Station early on a Tuesday morning. A massive solar storm was heading toward Earth, and it would hit in less than 24 hours. Both the Moon and Mars teams needed to prepare quickly. Dr. Kim Do-young received the alert while he was monitoring the Moon base construction. Mei-Rei, get all robots into the safety bunker, he ordered through the communication system. We can't risk losing them to the solar radiation. Park Mei-Rei worked fast, directing each robot to the protected underground area they had built. The robots carried samples of the precious ice they had found. Just as the last robot entered the bunker, the first wave of the solar storm reached the moon. The storm was stronger than anyone had expected. Static filled the communication channels. The video feeds from the moon showed only snow and static. Du Young and his team could do nothing but wait and hope their equipment would survive. In the Atacama Desert, Dr. Jin Hei-yun's team faced their own crisis. The solar storm interfered with all their communication systems. They couldn't contact the outside world. Their Mars-based simulation was now experiencing the same isolation that real Mars explorers would face. The radiation shield is holding, Lee Jun-ho reported, checking the instruments. But our communication dishes are useless now. We're completely cut off. Hei-yun gathered her team in the main room of their base. They had enough food and water for months, but being cut off from Earth was difficult. Some team members looked worried. This was exactly what critics said would happen on Mars, total isolation when things went wrong. Back at Moon Mission Control, Du Young's team managed to maintain weak contact with their base. The moon's closer distance to Earth meant some signals could still get through. They received basic data showing their robots were safe, but they couldn't send new commands. At least we know our base is still there, Mei-Rei said, trying to stay positive. She watched the static-filled screens, hoping to see their robots again. Hours passed. The storm grew stronger. Hei-yun's team in the desert used their time to test everything in their base. They needed to prove they could survive without help from Earth. Jun-ho worked on improving the radiation shield, making it even stronger. This is exactly like being on Mars, Hei-yun told her team during their evening meeting. We need to solve our problems by ourselves. No one can help us now. In the moon control room, Du Young received an unexpected message. Some of their ice samples had melted during the storm, but instead of being a disaster, the melted ice revealed something new. The water contained tiny bubbles of ancient air from when the moon was young. This could tell us about the early solar system, Du Young said excitedly. Even during a crisis, they were making discoveries. The solar storm lasted for 3 days. When it finally ended, both teams had learned important lessons. The moon base had survived with some damage, proving it was strong but not perfect. The Mars team had stayed safe behind their radiation shield, but experienced the fear of complete isolation. Do Young looked at the first clear pictures from his moon base. Some solar panels were damaged, and 2 robots needed repairs. But the base itself was intact, protected by the deep crater walls. He-Yun's team finally restored their communications. They had survived the isolation, but everyone understood the emotional cost. Being cut off from Earth was harder than they had expected. That evening, both team leaders received a message from the World Space Council. Both teams have shown strengths and weaknesses during this crisis. Perhaps it's time to consider a different approach. Neither He-Yun nor Du Young knew it yet, but the solar storm had changed more than their equipment. It had changed how everyone thought about space exploration. The real challenge wasn't choosing between the moon and Mars. It was figuring out how to work together to survive in space. 1 month after the solar storm, Dr. Choi Sun-woo arrived at both team locations to study how people acted under space-like conditions. As the leading space psychology researcher in Korea, she needed to understand what living on the moon or Mars would do to the human mind. Sun-woo visited the Mars desert base first. She watched Ho-Yun's team go about their daily work. The team lived in sealed rooms, wore spacesuits outside, and couldn't leave the base without permission, just like they would have to do on Mars. "Tell me how you felt during the solar storm," Sun-woo asked the team during their evening meal. They sat together in the base's small dining room, eating food grown in their greenhouse. "At first I was scared," Lee Jun-ho admitted. "But then something interesting happened. We became closer as a team. When we couldn't talk to the outside world, we talked more to each other." He-Yun nodded. "We played games in the evening. We shared stories about our families. We became like a small family ourselves." Sun-woo wrote everything down in her notebook. She noticed how the team members sat close together, how they finished each other's sentences, how they seemed to understand each other without words. Next, she visited the Moon team's control center on Earth. The team members worked in different rooms, each person focusing on their own computer screens. They could talk to their families every day and go home after work. "How do you feel about controlling robots on the moon?" she asked Park My-rae, who spent the most time working with the moon base robots. "Sometimes it feels lonely," My-rae answered. "The robots do what I tell them. But it's not the same as working with people. I can see Earth from the moon cameras, but it feels far away." Do Young showed Sun-woo the latest moon base pictures. "We're making great progress," he said. "But I worry about how people will feel living there. The moon is close to Earth, but you can't just go home when you miss your family." That evening, Sun-woo wrote her report for the World Space Council. Her findings surprised everyone. The Mars team shows stronger emotional bonds. Living in complete isolation made them depend on each other. They have created a strong community that helps them handle stress. The distance from Earth forces them to become more independent and resourceful. The Moon team is more efficient but feels less connected. Being able to see Earth but not visit it causes unexpected stress. The closeness to home makes the separation feel more difficult, not easier. Most surprising is how the Mars team handles isolation better than the Moon team. On Mars, people accept that they must create a new home. On the Moon, the sight of Earth creates constant homesickness. He-Yun read the report in her desert base office. She had never thought about these psychological differences. Her team wasn't just surviving in isolation. They were creating a new way of living. Do-young also read the report in his control room. He realized that being closer to Earth wasn't always better. Perhaps they needed to think differently about what makes a good space home. That night, Sun Wu made one final note in her research. Success in space depends not just on technology, but on human connections. The best place for humans in space might not be the one closest to Earth, but the one that helps us build the strongest communities. The World Space Council would have much to think about. The choice between the Moon and Mars now included more than just technical problems. They had to consider what would make people not just survive, but truly live in space. Kang Min-ji had worked as a junior researcher on both the Moon and Mars projects. She spent 6 months with each team, taking notes and learning everything she could. Now, sitting in her small office late one night, she noticed something that everyone else had missed. "This can't be right," she said to herself, checking her calculations again. "It's too simple." But the numbers didn't lie. She had found a way to make both projects work together. The next morning, Min-ji requested an emergency meeting with both team leaders. Dr. Jin Hae-yun and Dr. Kim Do-young sat across from her at the conference table, looking curious but tired after months of competition. "Look at these numbers," Min-ji said, showing them her computer screen. "The Moon team's ice can power the Mars team's ships. The Mars team's radiation shield can protect the Moon base. We're not rivals. We're two parts of the same solution." Hae-yun leaned forward, suddenly alert. "Show me those calculations again." Min-ji explained her idea. The Moon's ice could be turned into rocket fuel more easily than anyone thought. With a few changes to Junho's radiation shield design, it could work on both the Moon and Mars. The Moon could become a fuel station for Mars missions. "But that's not all," Min-ji continued. She showed them more data. "The Moon base can test everything we want to do on Mars, but closer to home. If something goes wrong, help is only 3 days away, not 8 months." Do-young nodded slowly. "And the Mars base can teach us how to build real space communities. Dr. Choi's research showed us that." For the first time since their competition began, Hae-yun and Do-young looked at each other not as rivals, but as potential partners. "We need to test this," Hae-yun said. She called Lee Junho and asked him to check Min-ji's calculations for the radiation shield modifications. Do-young contacted Park Myrae. "Can you run some tests on the Moon ice? See if it matches Min-ji's fuel production numbers." The next few days were busy. Both teams worked together for the first time, sharing all their research. Junho discovered that the radiation shield would actually work better if they built it using metals from the Moon. Myrae found that making fuel on the Moon would be easier than making it on Earth. Min-ji worked with both teams, helping them understand how their projects fit together. "The Moon is like a practice run for Mars," she explained. "But it's also a necessary first step. We can't reach Mars safely without a Moon base to help us." 1 week later, they presented their combined plan to the World Space Council. Instead of choosing between Moon and Mars, they showed how to use both. The Moon would be humanity's first step into space, providing fuel and building materials. Mars would be the first true space colony, teaching humans how to live on another world. The council members listened carefully. When the presentation ended, the head of the council stood up. "This is not what we expected," she said, "but it might be exactly what we needed." Hae-yun and Do-young looked at Min-ji with pride. The young researcher had seen what everyone else had missed. The path to space wasn't about choosing between the Moon and Mars. It was about using them both. That evening, the three of them stood on the roof of the research building, looking at the Moon and Mars in the night sky. "Think about it," Min-ji said quietly. "Soon we'll have homes on both of them." The competition was over. The real work of reaching for the stars was about to begin. 6 months after Kang Min-ji's breakthrough, the combined Moon-Mars project moved forward quickly. Dr. Jin Hae-yun and Dr. Kim Do-young now shared a large office at the new Space Development Center in Seoul. Their teams worked together in ways no one had imagined before. Engineer Yoon Ta-hyun, joined the project to design a new transport system. He had spent 20 years building advanced rockets, and now he had the chance to create something completely new. His design would connect Earth, Moon, and Mars in a continuous travel network. Think of it like a space train system, Ta-hyun explained during a project meeting. He showed his designs on the large screen. Ships will leave Earth, stop at the Moon to refuel, then continue to Mars. Other ships will bring Moon minerals back to Earth or carry supplies between the Moon and Mars. Park My-rae's robots on the Moon now had a bigger job. They weren't just building a research station anymore. They were building a spaceport. The robots dug deep into the lunar surface, creating underground fuel tanks that would store rocket fuel made from moon ice. "The tanks are almost ready," My-rae reported one morning. "We can start making fuel next month." She showed the others a video of her robots welding the final sections of the fuel storage system. Lee Jun-ho worked with both teams to install his improved radiation shields. The new design used moon metals, making the shields stronger and lighter than before. "The shields now stop 99% of harmful radiation," he said proudly. "We can protect people anywhere in space." Hyun focused on the Mars-based design. She worked with Dr. Choi Sun-woo to create living spaces that would keep people healthy and happy. They planned gardens, community areas, and private spaces where people could feel at home even on another planet. "The Mars base will be more than just a research station," Hyun explained to visitors. "It will be the first true city on another world." Do-young managed the Moon operations, making sure everything was ready to support both Moon residents and Mars missions. His team built medical facilities, repair shops, and storage areas for supplies. The Moon base would be like a city too, but one designed to help ships and crews on their way to Mars. One day, as Min-ji walked through the Space Development Center, she saw something that made her smile. The old signs that had separated the Moon and Mars teams were gone. Now there was just one sign: Human Space Development Project, reaching for the stars together. The World Space Council was pleased with the progress. They sent a message to the team: "You have shown us that space exploration works best when we combine our strengths." The Moon and Mars projects are no longer separate missions. They are humanity's first steps into the solar system. That evening, Hyun and Do-young stood in their office, looking at the latest pictures from both bases. The Moon base gleamed silver in the sunlight, its solar panels spreading out like wings. The Mars base design showed a red dome, under which gardens would grow and people would live. "Remember when we were competitors?" Do-young asked, smiling. "Now we're building the future together," Hyun replied. "And it's better than anything we could have done alone." Outside their office, the teams worked late into the night. Engineers checked rocket designs, scientists studied Mars soil samples, and mission planners mapped out the first combined Moon-Mars missions. The space age was truly beginning, and it would start with not one world, but two. 10 years had passed since the Moon and Mars teams joined forces. Dr. Jin Hyun stood at the window of her office on the Moon, looking at Earth floating in the black sky. She remembered when all of this had been just plans on paper. The Moon base had grown into a small city. 500 people now lived and worked there. Ships arrived from Earth every week, bringing supplies and new crew members. Other ships left for Mars regularly, carrying people and materials to the Red Planet. Dr. Kim Do-young's office was on Mars now. He led the first permanent Mars settlement, where 200 people lived under the large protective domes. They grew their own food in huge greenhouses and made their own air from Mars ice. The radiation shields, improved over the years, kept everyone safe. Park My-rae's robots still worked on the Moon, but now they had human helpers. She had trained a new generation of engineers to maintain the machines that made rocket fuel from moon ice. The fuel production never stopped. There were always ships needing fuel for their journeys. Lee Jun-ho split his time between the Moon and Mars, checking the radiation shields and training new technicians. His shields had worked so well that other countries wanted to use them for their own space projects. Dr. Choi Sun-woo had written several books about how people adapted to life in space. The Mars community was especially interesting to her. They have created their own culture, she wrote. They are not just Earth people living on Mars. They are becoming Martians. Kang Min-ji, whose idea had started it all, now led the Space Development Center on Earth. She coordinated all the traffic between the three worlds, Earth, Moon, and Mars. Her office walls were covered with pictures of ships moving between the planets. One morning, Hae-yeon received an urgent message from Do-young on Mars. "We found something in the deep soil tests," he wrote. "There might have been simple life on Mars long ago. We need more scientists here to study it." Hae-yeon smiled as she read the message. There were always new discoveries, new challenges, new reasons to push further into space. She looked at her calendar, where the next big project was marked: Jupiter Moon Mission Planning. First meeting. She walked to the Moon base's main hall, where new arrivals from Earth were gathering. Young scientists and engineers looked around with wide eyes, excited to be part of humanity's greatest adventure. Hae-yeon remembered feeling the same way 10 years ago. "Welcome to the Moon," she told them. "Some of you will stay here to help run our fuel stations and laboratories. Others will continue to Mars, where you'll help build humanity's second home. But all of you are part of something bigger than just Moon or Mars exploration. You're part of humanity's journey to the stars." That evening, Hae-yeon sent a message to Earth. It went to a special museum in Seoul, where the old competition between Moon and Mars was now just a historical display. Next to it stood a larger exhibit showing how the combined program had succeeded. The message was simple: ready to begin Jupiter Moon planning. The Moon taught us how to take our first steps into space. Mars taught us how to build new homes away from Earth. Now it's time to go even further. As night fell on the Moon base, Hae-yeon watched the stars. Somewhere out there, Europa, one of Jupiter's moons, waited to be explored. The question was no longer whether to go to the Moon or Mars. Now the question was, how far could humanity reach? The answer, she knew, was as limitless as space itself.